for you, Becky. Oops, I don't know why it started. Let me stop. I'm going to start recording. We get a lot of folks who join us on the recordings as well. So this is for you. All right. So hello and welcome to EIHR's 2023-2024 webinar series, Voices of Children and Youth. I am Kim Klett, the Deputy Executive Director of the Educators Institute for Human Rights. If you haven't already, feel free to put where you are joining us from in the chat box. I would like to begin by telling you just a little bit about EIHR. Taking lessons from the Holocaust and other historic human rights violations, EIHR develops teaching materials, convenes training workshops and summits, and supports educator networks to give secondary students a deeper understanding of how egregious conflicts arise and evolve, how justice is served, and most importantly, how we can prevent future atrocities. And here's our Executive Director, Kate English, with a brief message.
Thank you, Kim, and welcome everyone who's joining us live and everyone who's joining us via YouTube. We're glad to see you. I just have a brief appeal. We're so glad to have you with us today and especially happy to offer this as a free program. If you're able, please consider donating to EIHR in whatever capacity you can, or even consider making a monthly donation. And you would continue to help teachers around the world in their work to end hate. So thank you very much. And you can donate at the link that Kim just put in the chat box. It's really easy. It's eihr.org/donate. Thank you, Kim.
Thank you, Kate. And also please visit our website at www.eihr.org to find our many resources. This year's theme for our webinar series was voted on by our viewers, and we are excited to continue bringing you a rich variety of speakers. It is often said that a society can be measured by the way it treats its weakest members, and that often includes children. We want to bring that focus in this series and not only bring awareness, but also look at ways you can get involved. We hope you will register for April's webinar, which we will have the link coming soon. It will be with Dr. Samuel Torres from NABS, or the Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. We will send all the links mentioned today in a follow-up email that you will receive in addition to the recording. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the land where EIHR's office resides. EIHR respectfully acknowledges the Piscataway and Nankachank, or Anacostan people, and the elders both past and present throughout the generations who have stewarded the land where EIHR gathers. And now I would like to introduce our wonderful guest today. Rebecca Tinsley is a former BBC journalist who works in places where there have been genocide. Following a trip to Darfur at the height of the killing in 2004, she founded Waging Peace, which supports Sudanese dissidents. She also founded Network for Africa, a mental health charity helping people in post-conflict communities, including Rwanda, Sierra Leone, and Uganda. During the Bosnian War, she sent convoys of humanitarian aid to Bosnian Muslim refugees. She is also chair of the Free Yezidi Foundation. Tinsley writes about genocide, Africa, and development, and 3 of her novels have also been commercially published in English. The novel about Sudan is also in Arabic. She also contributes papers to academic books on Africa. Please drop any questions into the chat box anytime during the program, and we'll be sure to address them. And Becky, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I will share your PowerPoint.
Thank you very much indeed to Kim and to Kate, and hello to everybody. Thank you for spending some of your Sunday with me and with us. The good news is you're not going to have to look at my face for much longer, because I have a PowerPoint of slides which I hope will illustrate what I'm going to talk about. The bad news is that I have 2 observations right at the top about children in a situation of conflict and genocide, which is what I've really been working on in a voluntary capacity for the past 30 years. I'm going to tell you some stories about Yazidis, Rwandan Tutsis, people in Sierra Leone and Sudan. But I want you to know that I have the permission of the people whose stories I'm going to tell. I am changing their names, but they have, all of them said that they're happy for me to talk about their lives in the hope that it illuminates a subject that really doesn't get enough attention. So my first observation, a general observation, is that in a large part of the world, if you are an orphan of conflict, you don't get any sympathy. It is a bit like, if any of you have read your Charles Dickens, you'll know that it wasn't that long ago that in our societies, children who were orphans were an embarrassment and actually regarded as bad luck. And unfortunately, in traditional conservative societies around the world, this is still the case. In a lot of cases, superstition is brought to bear, and people think that an orphan is probably offended their ancestors. So they don't get the sympathy or the support that they deserve, and therefore it sort of doubles the trauma that they suffer, and it certainly increases their sense of isolation. My second observation is that you can never underestimate the willingness of adults to exploit vulnerable children. When I started on my journey 30 years ago looking at this, I was shocked because, you know, the society I live in is one that sort of wraps an awful lot of our children in cotton wool. And so it was a shock to me to find so many adults willing to exploit and manipulate children. You know, children who end up sleeping on the street because it's actually safer than sort of sleeping on the sofa or in the spare room of a relative or an adult who says, oh, it's okay, I'll take care of you. At best, they end up as servants or slaves. And of course, at worst, they are, well, they are rented out for sex. And also another thing that I'd noticed is that adults in positions of authority, for instance, magistrates, are open to being bribed. So for instance, in Rwanda, when survivors of genocide came forward to the courts to try to claim their parents' land, you know, they would often find that a magistrate had been bribed by the person currently living in that house to not allow the child to have that property back. So that's all a bit of a shock. So if we could have the first slide, please. 20 years ago, when I arrived, the day I arrived in Rwanda, we left the airport terminal and found a child dead on the grass outside the terminal. This child had been sniffing glue and had died of an overdose. This was a typical example of a child, an orphan, who had realized it was actually safer to live on the streets, not in the case of this particular child, but it made me think about the choice that a child makes to think that they would prefer to sleep rough in such an uncaring society. And as I say, I'm not making a point about Africans, because our own society was like this 100, 150 years ago. From the airport, we immediately went to an orphanage in Kigali, and it was run by a man who proclaimed himself a pastor, a religious man, and he spoke mostly about himself. And when we asked him what future the orphans would have, he said, oh, well, the girls, you know, we'll teach them to make baskets, and the boys, maybe they could be car mechanics. And we then asked to meet the orphans, and he looked shocked, because why would we want to meet the orphans rather than listen to him praising himself? And I remember meeting a young woman, a young girl, 15 years old, who was a genocide orphan. And I said to her, you know, what are your plans? what do you want to do? And she said to me, I want to be a doctor because Rwanda doesn't have enough doctors and I want to heal people. And I asked a young man, maybe 17 years old, what do you want to do? And he said, I want to be a lawyer because I want to prosecute the people who killed my family. And it was at that moment, this disconnect between how an adult thought that these children, these orphans, should progress, and how the orphans themselves felt about their agency. It was at this moment that I knew that maybe I had a small role to play in Rwanda. And to be honest, how can you not want to give a helping hand to someone, a young person who is already helping themselves so much with no self-pity? These were people who said, I am not a victim, I am a survivor. Now, the young man you're looking at, his name is John. If you look at that photograph, you can see where a Hutu tried to kill him with a machete. If you look at the next slide, please, you'll see the back of John's head. Again, he was 8 years old when the genocide happened in 1994, and like many survivors, the only reason he is alive today was that he had the wit to hide under dead bodies until the Hutu genocide had gone on elsewhere. And just think for a minute what presence of mind it takes in a chaotic situation for an 8-year-old to realize that this is what he's got to do to survive. And it was a story I heard again and again. And it is remarkable considering this young man will have just seen his parents killed. But the one thing that John doesn't get and hasn't had, of course, is justice. What he wanted was to know where his parents were buried so that he could have some form of closure. And one of that is something that is common to an awful lot of genocide survivors who are young. This feeling that they will never know where their parents ended up. Another thing that is common to them is that it is hard as they go through life to form relationships and to build trust, because if you have lost someone, and well, everyone in your life at some early age, how can you then ever believe that it is worth loving someone because they may be taken from you? Another issue, of course, is children born of rape to very young mothers. This was something that happened throughout the 100 days of genocide in Rwanda, was the systematic rape, the use of rape as a weapon of war, and therefore a whole generation being born who know that they were born because their mothers were raped. And that adds an entire layer of trauma to the survivors. And it's incredibly difficult for everybody concerned. If we could have the next slide, please. This is a young woman called Mary, and she is giving her testimony. Again, have a look at her face and her neck to see where the genocidaire tried to cut her head off. The woman holding her name is Mama Lambert, and I've known her for 20 years. Mama Lambert's husband and her 3 children were killed in the genocide in front of her. And Mama Lambert has devoted the last 30 years, to trying to support other survivors, young survivors of the genocide. She went to court to try to find, when the person who was responsible for killing her family came on trial. Rwanda, of course, is a poor country, and they could not put everybody in jail who was responsible for the genocide. They only had enough money to put in prison the people who were masterminds of the genocide, or people who had killed 100 or more Tutsi. And but they developed a system, a sort of magistrate system of hearing many, many cases in a traditional manner called gacaca, which means on the grass, under the trees, and they would literally meet on the village green, and a lay magistrate would hear the cases of people who were accused of committing genocide. And Mama Lambert turned up to confront the person who had admitted to killing her family. And we hear an awful lot in the West about how everything's okay now, and everybody has asked for forgiveness and everybody's moved on. And I think that any of you who know about human nature will know that that's not very likely. And in the case of Mama Lambert, what she really wanted to know was where her children and her husband are buried. And the man who killed them looked her in the eye and said, I will admit that I killed your family, but I'm never going to tell you where they are, because that's the one last thing that I can hold over you. And sadly, this is the case in an awful lot of situations. And it does mean that it's really, really hard to get justice. I could go on and on. I haven't got time today. All the anecdotes I've heard, people, orphans that I've interviewed who've experienced the same thing, the one thing they want, justice. And in the words of one young woman who I've come to know very well, she eventually said to me, I just gave up on justice, and instead I just decided to forgive them, forgive the people who killed all my family, because frankly, the burden was just too enormous to carry around. And that lack of justice was going to warp the rest of my life. So I said, you know what? I'm just going to forgive, and I'm going to try and move on. But here's one of the things that does linger for young people like Mary here, is even though she goes to university and gets qualifications, it's incredibly hard for her to get a decent job, because Rwanda and many African countries, many countries in the developing world, are still run on the basis of family and who you know, rather than your merit and your qualifications. And because she is an orphan, she doesn't have the family links to get her a good job. And I have interviewed so many orphans, not just in Rwanda, who tell me that when they apply for a job, they will get down to the last two in the interview process, and they know that they're better qualified than the other person in the running for the job, but at the last minute, it will be the other person who gets the job because they have the family links, which is immensely frustrating. Another thing to bear in mind, if you are an orphan like Mary, is that because Rwanda is a poor country, like so many African countries, they have not got the capacity to lock people up. Those people who committed genocide are still living there in the community. So someone like Mary can leave her house every morning and look into the eyes of the person who killed her family and, maybe raped her. And it is just one of the things we don't really take on board. She doesn't have the resources to move, and the person who killed her family also doesn't have the desire to move. And, she will have to get on a bus, for instance, and look around that bus to see if there are any people from the other ethnic group, because she might still be in danger, because she is a witness. It's not, this may have happened 30 years ago, but in that respect, it is like it happened yesterday. And again, on my first day in Rwanda, I remember going to church that evening. And for the first time in my life, I sat and looked at a church congregation, and there was not one gray head in that congregation, because they had all been killed. And it was like going to a wedding, which I also did a few days later. And it was the only wedding I'd ever been to when there was only one generation present. And it just makes you think, this is an entirely different society because of what these people went through. And we can, in the question session, we can talk about why these genocides happen. But just bear in mind, all of these aspects that are particularly hard for orphans, and I would suggest particularly hard for girls, of course, because women like Mary, she was, having survived the actual attempt to kill her, again by hiding under dead bodies, she was then picked up by the French Foreign Legion, who were there on the side of the Hutu killers. And she was taken to a French battalion camp, where she was held for a month as a sex slave and raped every day by the French soldiers. And it's rather naive of us to think that a young woman like that is just going to get over it, and that, just because the government dictates that we're all Rwandan now and everything's okay, that has any real meaning in her life. So the next slide, please. What does one do about this? This photograph was taken, as anybody who knows me will see that I've aged quite a lot since then. That photograph was taken 20 years ago. One of the solutions that the Rwandan government had after the genocide, it had hundreds of thousands of orphans, and it recognized that orphanages like the ones I had visited were inadequate and inappropriate. They also recognized that there were a lot of orphans who had formed themselves into what are called child-headed households, and they were living in the streets or, in makeshift accommodation. And in that photograph, you see a young man standing beside me at the back, not my husband, Henry, that who's the white guy with the thinning hair. This guy is Peter, and he was 20, and he is the father of that family, that self-defining family of orphans. They're not related, but he's the oldest one, and he was the one who was taking responsibility for all those kids. So when we were faced with, what do you do to help these people who define themselves as survivors, not victims? One of the obvious things to do would be to build houses for those child-headed households. And behind me, you can see one of them. And we started building them. And we did that, the 4-bedroomed house. We started building a whole bunch of them back in 2004-05. And we were building those for $5,600 each. And no, there is no electricity or running water, but believe me, those are like palaces if you've been living on the street in a child-headed household. One of the ironies, incidentally, about expecting children, as they were, to take care of themselves and recognizing their resilience and that they were very mature because they'd all been through the most horrific things. But one of the ironies was that even when electricity and running water did come, these kids weren't old enough to get a utility account. I mean, it's just part of the madness, really. Next slide, please. One of the other things we realized that needed to happen was that there were an awful lot, hundreds and thousands of orphans who were profoundly traumatized by what they had witnessed. They had been through the survival stage, this incredible strength and resilience and resourcefulness they found to survive the genocide and then the incredibly challenging years after. But then, once they found somewhere to live, or at least a more stable existence, then the trauma kicked in. And this is post-traumatic stress disorder, as you might guess. And it is the constant, in some cases, every half hour, being triggered to relive the most dreadful moment in your life. And I remember asking genocide orphans, so what could we do that would be useful? Rather than trying to impose a white, privileged, middle-class idea, Western, rich world idea, what they need, we decided to have the humility to ask people what they thought they needed. And I thought they would say, well, we'd like a school. But one of the things people said to me repeatedly was, it is no good you trying to train me to be, a hairdresser or a doctor, because I can't concentrate, because I am blocked by the trauma that just keeps going through my mind. So we decided to try to do trauma counseling. Now, obviously, it would be utterly inappropriate to have a bunch of white people arrive. Apart from anything else, there's no money to do it. So, and it's a different culture, and there are just a million reasons why it wouldn't work. So, I recruited a group of volunteer American psychotherapists to come to Rwanda with me. And one of them is here in this photograph. This is Dr. Barbara Bauer from Missouri. She has now been to Rwanda about 10 times doing courses. She's been to Uganda with us more than 20 times, and Sierra Leone, doing exactly the same thing. And what she does is she spends several weeks training a cohort of survivors, all orphans, genocide orphans, bright orphans. She trains them in the basics of being a lay counselor. And she comes back year after year and gives refresher courses. And those lay counselors then go and train others. And it's called the cascade system. And what you're seeing here in this photograph is a training. One genocide orphan is practicing on doing one-to-one counseling, psychotherapy with a survivor who is also a trainee. And it works remarkably well. And we were just amazed by how these genocide orphans stepped up to the plate. And, the training, of course, could be very, very dramatic, because they would go into fugue states and have flashbacks until they managed to learn how to control and manage the flashbacks. And we always said, we're going to train you to be able to train other people in how to manage flashbacks and post-traumatic stress disorder. We are never going to represent to you that we can end it or cure it, but the key is to manage it so that the moment you feel the beginning of a flashback, you can take your mind to another place, a safe space, and you know how to literally direct your thoughts. And we've equipped them with all kinds of different cognitive behavior therapy. Barbara and Shelley, who is her accomplice, also from Missouri, they together have now trained at least 2,500 orphans to be counselors. And once the initial training is done and they feel confident, they then do group therapy sessions every other week, and they do individual counseling. And we have now reached tens of thousands of traumatized people in Rwanda, Uganda, and Sierra Leone using this method. And I'm really proud of this, because it's incredibly inexpensive to do, and it actually empowers the people, rather than having a bunch of white people come and boss them around. We have passed on the skills that enable local people to set up their own charities and to do this work. What we found that is quite interesting is that there's a point that comes when the people involved in these groups, these group counseling sessions, they can manage to sort of diminish the trauma, and they can manage the flashbacks. And then they come to us and say, well, that's very nice and thank you, but how do I now earn a living? And so we have helped them to form self-help groups and savings and loans groups, like a kind of mutual funds groups, where they save a bit of money. And now, more recently, we're doing enterprise training, so that there's a kind of a progress from having learned to manage the trauma to get to the next stage of supporting each other, no longer feeling in isolation. If you like, forming a kind of a family of non-blood relatives, and then giving them the enterprise training, and they go out into the world and form businesses. And it's at this stage that I want to thank my friends who have joined this call, who have generously supported this work over the years, who have made this possible. Network for Africa has now been going for 20 years, and this is our work. And I'm so delighted that we're still going, and we are spreading all the time, because the word travels that we have this method of creating what we call peer counselors, and more people turn up and want to be trained. So if we could have the next slide, please. The word spread to, if we could go back one, please. Oh, okay, yes, sorry, actually, yes, this is right. This is one of the group counseling groups. You can see they are sitting, this was taken during the COVID epidemic. This is how the group counseling goes. And this photo was taken at the health education section of a hospital that we built, that Network for Africa helped a local charity to build. And I'm rather proud of this, because it started with a very simple, one-room surgery. And local people decided they liked what we were doing, because we had asked them what they needed. And they said, well, a hospital would be nice, because 1 out of 5 kids here dies before the age of 10. And so we built this hospital, and more people turned up to help us. And it has now got a pharmacy and an education center. It has beds so people can come in overnight. They can do simple operations. They can do tests and x-rays. It's amazing the way it has grown, all because local people came and helped us. So if we could have the next slide, please. And again, thank you to the supporters who are on this call, this Zoom call. As I said, that the word had spread, and the word spread as far as Iraq. And we, believe it or not, Network for Africa was asked to come and meet people from the Free Yezidi Foundation. All of these young women are Yezidi. They are an ethnic minority in Iraq. And when Islamic State moved in to northern Iraq, they were intent on killing all of the Yezidi, who they regard as devil worshippers. And they killed as many of the men as they could find. And they kidnapped all the women and children. They made the little boys, they brainwashed them and made them become IS soldiers, or they killed them. And they turned the young women into sex slaves, who they then traded on WhatsApp. And these WhatsApp groups continue to exist. And these young women that you see in this picture, and I do have their permission to use this photo, they had all been traded by the Arabs who bid for them on WhatsApp. And many of them were sold and resold maybe 10, 12 times. And, serially raped by the people who'd bought them, but they escaped, which is why they are in this camp run by the Free Yezidi Foundation. And the person you can see right at the front of the photo with the blonde hair, this is Shelley, who I mentioned, who is from Missouri. And she and Barbara came with me to Iraq, to northern Iraq, to meet the Yezidi as soon as, sorry, I've got to get rid of a phone call. They came with me as soon as Islamic State had been pushed out of northern Iraq, because the Free Yezidi Foundation said, we've heard what you're doing, and we have a lot of traumatized people here, but we have, no psychotherapists, and it would be great if you could come and teach your basic idea, which we did. Now, the sad bit of this, unfortunately, is that there are still nearly 3,000 girls who are missing, who are being held as slaves in Turkey and in Syria and in Iraq. And the authorities know where these women are. They know where they are because they know that there are companies running these WhatsApp groups. where these women are traded. But the president of Turkey, whenever his police approach him and say to him, you know, we suspect that women are being held here, there, or elsewhere, he says, no, I don't want you to do anything about it. Moreover, the Iraqi government refuses to actually prosecute the members of Islamic State that it has in custody for killing the Yezidi, because they regard this minority as a minority worthy of contempt, because you know, the people who run Iraq are Muslim and the Yezidi are Yezidi. And as is the way with so many genocides, this is a minority that is scapegoated and blamed for everything. And incidentally, I should have mentioned that the Tutsi in Rwanda, one of the first things I was told about them was they were known as the Jews of Africa. Scapegoated, and of course resented because they were associated with people who were educated and industrious and entrepreneurial. So society never learns. If we could have the next slide, please. Our fame also spread to Sierra Leone. This young man, if you can look at his arms, you'll see one of them was chopped off by the warlords during the civil war in Sierra Leone, because he refused to join the militia. And the word spread to Sierra Leone about our very simple method of doing trauma counseling, and we've set up groups there. And he is one of the people who has been through our enterprise training group, and he is now a tailor, and that's how he sustains himself. So if we could have the next slide, please. 20 years ago, during the height of the killing in Sudan, as Kim mentioned at the beginning, a friend of mine who's a politician, a British politician, he and I went to Darfur. At the time, they weren't allowing any journalists in. They still aren't. So 20 years later, there really isn't an awful lot of documentary evidence about what is happening there. I wish I could tell you that this was a matter of history, but it's not, because all the things that I'm going to describe to you and that you will see in these pictures are still happening. We ended up collecting a lot of drawings by Darfuri children purely by accident. When I came back from Darfur, having interviewed a lot of survivors there, I set up a little NGO called Waging Peace to try to influence the British government, which was a pretty thankless task. So we ended up working to help Sudanese refugees who got to the UK. But we made a trip to the refugee camps in Chad along the border with Sudan, with Darfur, where about 500,000 Darfuris had fled in 2004. And we were there interviewing survivors and taking their testimony in the rather vain hope that one day these people will get justice. Anyway, we were trying to interview the mothers, and their children kept getting in the way. So we decided to give the children paper and crayons. And we said to them, not even thinking, we said to them, could you just draw pictures for us of your life? And we ended up with 500 drawings like this one that show the experience of what it was like to be a child in Darfur. And unfortunately, it is still like this. These things are still happening. And these 500 drawings we took to the International Criminal Court in The Hague, and they accepted them as evidence of the context of genocide, because there aren't any photographs and there's hardly any film, even though this has been going on for 20 years, this genocide in Darfur. And on the positive side, we were able to go back to the children who drew these pictures and say to them, you may be sitting here in a refugee camp in Chad, but we hope that one day you will bring to justice the people who did this to your family. Now, I want to point out just a couple of things in this drawing. The international community still refuses to understand that it was Arab racism at the heart of this genocide, and it is the Islamist ideology. I'm not saying Islam, I'm saying Islamist, which is political Islam, at the heart of the ideology. Instead, the international community, led by the Sudanese regime, say, oh, well, it's ancient ethnic hatreds, and it's really a competition over resources and climate change. But I would like you to have a look at the way the children of Darfur draw their own skin, which is black, and the way they draw the skin of the people killing them, which is a sort of reddy brown, because to them, that is how the Arabs look who are killing them. I would also like to draw your attention to the bottom right-hand corner, where you see women and girls being chained at the neck and led away into slavery. This is still happening. It was happening 20 years ago, and it's still happening right now because the war in Sudan resumed in a vengeance 1 year ago, April the 15th. And within 2 days of that war starting again in April, last April, women and girls were being gang raped systematically by the Arabs who want to eliminate these Black African Sudanese. And they were being abducted and led into slavery. And from what we gather, these girls and women are handed out to officers of the militia and the Sudanese armed forces to be their slaves. And of course, they are never seen again. If we could have the next slide, please. Again, this is through the eyes of the children who've endured it. Look at the complexion of the victims and look at the complexion of the people doing the killing. And when we first published these drawings, the regime, the Sudanese regime in Khartoum, which was then led by an Islamist junta, they said, well, this is all Zionist fake news, and Waging Peace, this charity, they're all Jews, and they're being paid by Israel to do this. And although my name is Rebecca, I'm not Jewish, but I am a human being, which is why I was there in Sudan and why I think that these drawings really need to be seen. The horror, one of the things that it doesn't show in these drawings is the after effects on a child who has been through this. And that is living in camps for, well, 20 years now, because they're still in these camps, and even more of them now, because now 11 million Sudanese out of a population of 45 million are in these camps. And society breaks down. The girls, unfortunately, bear the burden of shame because of the mass rape and because of the unwanted pregnancies. And their society sort of rots from within. And so the people who've been killing them achieve a multiple genocide. The first is when they ruin the lives of the girls. The second genocide is when they destroy these traditional conservative societies. And of course, the third genocide was when a lot of the girls who were raped discovered that they were HIV positive. And this is something I have heard both in Bosnia and in Rwanda, the same thing that survivors were told by the people killing them. The next slide, please. There are, we kept warning the British government that because there was no justice in Sudan after what happened in 2003-04, that inevitably this would happen again, and they ignored us, and of course it has happened again. And incidentally, I should mention that one of the reasons these pictures to me are extraordinary is that the children who drew them had no experience of television or magazines or news or war movies or ever seeing a helicopter or a weapon. So these pictures are an unfiltered vision of the conflict. This is, I mean, this is extraordinary, in that, you know, they had no preconceived idea of what this was happening to them, and yet here we are. Just to mention that there are now more dead in Sudan in the past year than there are in Gaza. But guess which is getting the more attention? And I have come to the conclusion that the blacker the skin, the less we seem to care. So the next slide, please. The good news, incidentally, is that we are, Waging Peace continues to help thousands of refugees who come to the United Kingdom. And I have a remarkable team of two young women who work tirelessly to provide as much help as possible to the Sudanese community in the UK. So I'm leaving you on a happier note. This is a more current picture of the Tinsley family, Henry, my husband, and me, with Ariane, who is a Tutsi Rwanda survivor, who I met 20 years ago when she was living on the street. The remarkable thing about Ariane is that she got an education. She always believed that she could make it, despite the fact that, you know, she saw all the family killed. She got a master's degree, and her job, the first job she had out of university, was finding scholarships for other Rwandan genocide orphans. So there was a nice kind of circle there, and there is her little girl. So a happy ending to that story. Next slide, please. Here's the book that I wrote. I decided that writing just another book of reportage about Darfur wasn't going to, nobody'd buy it, nobody'd be interested, because as I've said, Black lives in Africa don't seem to matter. So I tried writing it as a novel, putting together all the stories that I'd heard in a sort of a structure as a novel. And it's been translated into Arabic, and it is very, very popular with Sudanese, who tell me that it does tell the story of their lives, and they're quite proud of it. So the last slide, please, which is me giving His Majesty King Charles a copy of the novel. And I don't know whether anyone wants to ask a question about this, but King Charles has been amazingly supportive of what Waging Peace is doing with the British Sudanese community. So thank you so much for listening. As ever, I've talked too much, and frankly, I could go on forever on this subject. So I'm hoping that you have questions for me, please.
Yes, please. If anybody does have a question, put it in the chat box, and I'll make sure that we ask it of Becky. Becky, thank you. That was so powerful. So moving in so many ways. I'll just ask a question while I'm waiting to see if anybody else has one. Your work is inspiring and incredible, but I also wonder, is it difficult sometimes for you? You know, seeing all these images, hearing all these stories. How is that for you?
Well, thank you for the question. But first of all, it isn't really about me, this work. It's about people who have the courage and the resourcefulness and the resilience to say, I am a survivor, I am not a victim. But what I learned back during the Bosnian War, when I was so furious that I was 2 hours flying time away from Bosnia, and yet Europe was doing nothing. And it was down to Bill Clinton in the end to actually do something about Bosnia. I was so angry about this and so shamed by our attitude that I realized I had to do something. And that actually helped me deal with my anger, because I thought, well, if I do as much as I can, then I can go to bed every night and sleep properly. And that's kind of guided me ever since. And I think one's feeling of impotence comes from not doing what you can. I think as long, and you'll know this, Kim, because, you know, Kim and Kate, you're both doing your bit to educate people. As long as you are doing something about this, it makes it bearable.
Very true. Yes.
Yes. Rebecca, on that note, I'm wondering if all of the speaking that you do and the people that you meet, what are your thoughts about how educators in Western civilization or Western culture can do to engage students or to help find a solution?
Well, that's a really good question. One of the things that always disappoints me is that in order to get the attention of people in classrooms, I have to use a bit of shock. I have to tell the stories and get the young people to identify with the orphans. Then I find that they will engage. Rather more difficult with adults who think they're so sophisticated that, you know, they've seen it all and nothing will move them. And that's very frustrating. So I would always much rather speak to young people because their minds are not as cluttered with self-importance. But one thing I think is really important is for everybody to acknowledge that we are all capable of genocide. It is not something that Hutu do. It is not something that Israelis or Palestinians do. And it isn't something that Nazi Germans do. It's something that human beings do given the right circumstances. And I think that that is one of the keys to understanding that genocide is not a matter of history. It is something that is happening and will continue to happen because nobody is a totally good person. We're all a mixture of good and bad things. And if we have politicians who manipulate us, and if we have the economic circumstances that make it possible to marginalize, stigmatize, and dehumanize a group, a minority, then genocide is going to keep happening. I think that's really the most important thing that we can all be doing is getting that message across.
Exactly. And I think that that's what I appreciated about your book, When the Stars Fall to Earth. My students responded so well to it because you broke it down to a few people's stories. And they were people who were teenagers, you know, who were relatable to my teenagers, my high school seniors. And I feel like they really took so much more from it. And it did, you're right, it opened their eyes completely to something that they had never even heard about. They were shocked that they nor their parents had never heard about it. How do you break it down to, like you've talked about work in Sierra Leone and Uganda and Rwanda and all these different places, and we know that there are so many others. How do you decide where you want to work and where you want to help? Does something speak to you, or how does that process work?
Oh, that's really easy, Kim. We are always short of money, so it's just a question of it's just a question of keeping the projects going that we have. I was invited to do this in Rwanda, and so we worked there. The word spread to Uganda, and a friend of mine who is a remarkable 85-year-old member of the House of Lords, and my husband says she's insane. She dragged me to northern Uganda literally as the Lord's Resistance Army retreated and the buildings were still smoking, and said, "We need what you're doing, do it here." And then, you know, we had a connection with someone in Sierra Leone and a connection with someone in Iraq, the Free Yezidi Foundation. And so that's how it goes. And in June, I'll be going to Burundi because, again, somebody has heard about what we're doing. And then we will go there and see if it's feasible, and I'll try and raise the money.
It's always the point, isn't it?
Rebecca, you may not be aware, but there is at least one person on the webinar from Rwanda, and I believe another person from the Democratic Republic of Congo. And our participant from Rwanda wants to extend gratitude for the presentation and just reminding us all that they're preparing for the 30th commemoration of the genocide this year and next month, not even a month.
Yeah.
That's right. And it can never, ever get better for people who endured this. It's the pain, we shouldn't diminish it. I remember a few years ago, somebody, a white person saying to me, haven't they got over it yet? And it was an American who said this, and I of course responded and said, so it's been 150 years since your Civil War. How's that going? Not so well, really.
Point.
Since race is still such a huge issue in American politics.
Well, and I think that speaks to something that I know we've talked about internally at EIHR, and that is that there is such a thing as ending a war more humanely than other. I don't want to say there's such a thing as ending a war well, because you don't want the war to occur in the first place. But there have been incidents in history where there have been conflicts where the resolution of the conflict has been more successful, and therefore everything that follows has been healthier, right? So I think you make an excellent point about, clearly in the United States, we did not resolve the Civil War in a particularly productive way, and we continue to pay the price for it.
And I think therefore the need for justice is incredibly important in having a good end to a war. And Sudan is a perfect example of a place where there is no justice. And therefore the problems of marginalization and stigmatization and this Islamist ideology, which regards Black Africans as inferior, these things will just keep on. But the international community has not got the will to do something about it. And that is central to all of the things we've been talking about, is a lack of political will or an inability to concentrate long enough on situations and just to think, oh, it'll be over, not understanding that these things go on if there is no justice.
Thank you. So I want to get to a couple of the questions in the chat box. Corey is asking, she said, last week, the US government announced 47 million in humanitarian assistance for Sudan and Chad. Is humanitarian assistance even getting to those areas?
That's a really good question. One of the antagonists in the Sudanese war, the former government, the Sudanese armed forces, who carried out a coup and overthrew the fledgling democratic government, they are not allowing aid in to the extent that it's needed. They are using this political power to basically starve people. And what astonishes me is that the international community is not reacting with more force about this, because we could be stopping the weapons getting in for a start, because guess what? If you stop the weapons getting in, then the war would stop. And instead we pander to these warlords, and they are stopping the aid getting in. The good thing about the US aid, incidentally, is that it will go to those refugee camps in Chad that I spoke about, where there are now, 500,000 people. And I believe that they're now going to send it to South Sudan, to the border of Sudan, where the people from the Nuba Mountains are fleeing. So again, this is really good. And also, another great thing that America has done is that 2 weeks ago it appointed a special envoy from President Biden to Sudan. This is really important because nobody has taken the lead on sorting out the Sudanese problem. And there have been various efforts to have peace talks. There have been an African effort to get peace talks and an Arab effort. The African effort recognizes that it would be nice if Sudan was actually one day democratic. The Arab effort wants to make sure that there is no democracy in an Arab country. So they will do their best to make sure that we just have another junta. Thank you, America, for at least leading the way on this.
Well, and the special envoy that they have appointed, whose name is currently escaping me, but it's
Perriello.
someone. Yes, there we go, Tom Perriello. He has extensive experience in that region, so it's particularly gratifying to see that there was a great deal of thought put into the person that they selected for that role.
Yes.
And Sue says, you indicated that we are all a conglomeration of contradictions. She agrees with that. But beyond individuals, do you think that systems also are at play in these genocides and discriminations?
Yes. Let me tackle just one that worries me a great deal, and that is Islamism. And again, I am not talking about Islam, I'm talking about political Islam, which says that no human government is legitimate. At the moment, we have the international community just refuses to grapple with the fact that Islamism is feeding a toxic jihadism right across Africa, from Niger and Nigeria in the west right through to Somalia. And one of the aims is to eradicate not just Christians, but Black Africans. And we, the international community, are so worried about offending Arab opinion that we're doing nothing. So there is a system at the UN that is just completely gummed up. The Security Council, there is no political will to deal with this. People like the British government, Britain makes far too much of its money by laundering the money of the Gulf Arab regimes. That's basically what it is, and allowing them to buy property in London. And so we appease them, and we're absolutely terrified about confronting them, about supplying weapons and jihadist imams to all of these countries. And you add on top of that overpopulation and climate change and the fact that you have millions of young people without work, and it is a toxic mix, and it's not going to go away. And so we have an international system that is not able to acknowledge this and do something about it. So it's rather a failing. And also, I got to say, I really don't think, I feel like I'm living in the 1930s. There are so many third-rate politicians running countries at the moment. I mean, you look at the fact that France and Germany are dragging their feet about sending weapons to Ukraine, when anybody with a sense of history knows that we do have to push Russia out of Ukraine. Otherwise, this will go on and on. We are cursed by having a generation of really rather third-rate politicians, just as they had in the 1930s, who refused to acknowledge fascism, fundamentalism, extremism when it is right in front of them.
And I know we're a little over time, but I have two other questions in the chat box that I just wanted to see if you could address. One is about any comments on the fighting that we're seeing on the border of DRC and Rwanda.
Thank you for that question. I am not going to comment because I am not able to comment, because it would be politically very unwise of me, given that we have a project in Rwanda. However, to the person who asked this question, I really appreciate getting the question, and I feel profoundly about what is happening in the DRC, in the Eastern DRC. It is outrageous that 5 million people have died in the last, well, since 1996. And that the international community feels no sense of obligation to do anything about it, because we value our smartphones and our technology more than the minerals that we get from the DRC. We value them more than we value all the human rights that we say that we believe in. And it is just shocking and shameful that right now, there is an increasingly awful situation in the DRC, and that hundreds of thousands of civilians are having to flee from their homes because of the 100 plus gangs of warlords that are running amok.
Thank you. And the last question is one that I wanted to end with. Somebody had asked about, besides supporting organizations like EIHR and Waging Peace and Network for Africa, what else would you suggest that we can do in any of these situations to be of help?
Well, I think we all need to have the humility to realize that we should certainly be providing the tools to African civil society and the resources to African civil society, but we should not be imposing our ideas and thinking that they are always the answer. And what Network for Africa has done has always been to find a good local partner in these countries and to support them and to form a partnership with them, rather than trying to impose a white idea of how you solve problems. Because we need to have the humility to understand that we're never really going to understand these societies. And so what we try to do is support African civil society. And it is always really important to distinguish between African citizens and the corrupt and bloated elites that run these countries, who care nothing for their own people, who are quite happy to keep their own people poor and hungry and frightened, and in a state of having no agency whatsoever. And so I think whenever you can support any organization that is helping African civil society, free media in Africa, then that is a really important thing to do. And thank you very much, especially to my friends who have supported Network for Africa, who are on this call. Thank you so much for continuing to stand with us, because you are helping to transform lives all the time.
Thank you so much, Becky. We really appreciate it. Yeah, Kate.
Yeah, there's one comment in the chat that I want to make sure that we address, and I'm not clear. Stu posted a question about the use of the term political Islam/Islamism, and I'm not sure if it's an incredulity or if it's a lack of clarification. But I'm just wondering if you maybe can say a little bit more about that to clarify.
Sure, yes. And first of all, I should say that I have devoted the last 30 years to trying to help Muslims, first in Bosnia and now in Sudan. So I am not anti-Islamic. However, what I do find difficult is the idea of political Islamism, which says that man-made government has no role in a country, and that basically the warlords should be allowed to run these countries. Political Islam says that you can't have governments, you can't have human beings doing things, that it's all about their sick interpretation of Islam, which tends to be violent, and it tends to be jihadist and imposing on the population what they think. And believe me, an awful lot of Muslims do not agree with Islamism. They want a human-made government, and they want modern medicine, and they want modern education systems, and all the things that Islamism doesn't want. So I hope I've made that clear. Islamism, a perfect example, Iran, Afghanistan, that's Islamism.
Thank you, and I hope that answers her question.
Yes. Well, I want to thank you, Becky, first of all, for this wonderful presentation. So much to think about and consider as we move forward. And I'd like to thank all the participants for joining us. You will receive a follow-up email in the next few days that will include the recording if you want to rewatch it. Let your friends know about it. And also all of the links that we shared, we will put in as well. And I'm seeing several kudos in the chat box to you, Becky. So thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you, and all power to you and Kate and what you're doing.
Thank you. Likewise. All right. Thank you. We hope we see you all next month.